you have a number of armed groups that Maduro and the Chavistas had equipped in the event that the U.S. were to intervene. And this is, part and parcel of Chavismo, was this notion of this sort of revolutionary fighting, and if need be, that they would undertake this effort at fighting from the mountains and from the Amazon forest in the southeast of Venezuela. I think that is obviously a concern.
As we take stock of an extraordinary day in global politics, President Trump stunned the world this morning when he announced that U.S. Special Forces had captured Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and his wife, and taken them from the country. The couple have been indicted on various charges relating to drugs, arms, and terrorism. The U.S. president has held a news conference at his ranch in Mar-a-Lago, lasting more than an hour. He said U.S. forces quickly overwhelmed their Venezuelan counterparts.
We are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. We want peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela.
Well, what does that mean, and what does the removal of the president mean for the immediate future of Venezuela? When pressed by reporters as to who inside Venezuela would form part of the transition, Trump said his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has been talking to Delcy Rodriguez, who was Maduro's vice president. Trump has also been asked if he's been in contact with the Nobel Peace Prize winning opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, but he said he had not spoken to her yet, adding that it would be very tough for Machado to be the leader of Venezuela. We are going to be discussing all of this, what it means for the US, for Latin America, and for the rest of the world. I'm going to talk to Alistair Burt, who is a former Conservative Foreign Office Minister. Good afternoon to you, Alistair.
Hello, Carol. Happy New Year.
And a Happy New Year to you. Mariano Alba is a Venezuelan lawyer specialising in international law and foreign affairs, also an associate fellow for the Latin America programme at the Institute for Strategic Studies. Good evening to you, Mariano.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation.
And Brett Bruen is the president of the Global Situation Room. He's a former White House director of global engagement. He's also a former US diplomat who has worked in Venezuela, amongst other places. Brett, let me just start with you. I'm sure you will have heard at least some of what President Trump was saying in that extraordinary hour-long news conference. What do you make of what you heard?
Well, look, from a tactical level, the operation went quite well, and Trump rightly is taking credit for that. However, he went several steps beyond, and I think a lot of folks here in Washington are a bit perplexed by this notion that we are apparently now running Venezuela. In general, one need only look at Iraq, Afghanistan, among others. U.S. occupation of countries has not gone very well. And so it is important, I think, to unpack what he actually means. And then, as you mentioned, Carol, he seemed to undermine Maria Corina Machado, who is, by all accounts, the opposition leader, someone who Maduro prohibited from running in the elections in the summer. And so this is a rather curious situation where Trump, on the one hand, is saying the Chavistas are no longer in power. It doesn't seem, at least up until now, that he's taken any other steps apart from what he referenced in the press conference was, Marco Rubio has talked to Delcy Rodriguez, who said, yeah, sure, you guys can have Venezuela. But apart from that, what other steps is the U.S. taking? He spent a lot of time talking about Venezuelan oil, and we can get into that, which is a whole complex, messy situation in and of itself. But I think a lot of Americans right now are wondering why it is that we are running Venezuela, according to Donald Trump.
Yeah, particularly since he was a US president who talked about how he wanted to end wars. Brett, I would like to come back to you on several of those points that you made there, not least the question of oil. But let's just turn to Alistair Burt, who's a former Conservative Foreign Office minister, was responsible for Latin America at some point, and was also a non-executive director for President Energy, which worked in South America. Alistair, we've had the briefest of statements from the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, saying that the UK was not involved, that the UK stood for international law, and essentially it seemed as though he had absolutely no idea what was going on. How do you think the British government should respond to this?
I think the Prime Minister will be quite caught. On the one hand, he must defend international law. And it seems that we have a president of the United States who has no interest in this. We've moved into a new era in which, as far as the Western Hemisphere is concerned, the United States is making it clear it will be judge, jury, and executioner. It will decide what is in the United States' interest, and it will take action accordingly. There's no recent precedent for this. And it poses all sorts of questions, not least Cuba, potentially Greenland. If President Trump decides that the United States security is integral with them occupying or controlling Greenland, what happens next? So a whole series of questions are raised. On the other hand, Trump's challenge to the rest of the world is, you all agree with me that President Maduro was a bad man, running the country badly, potentially a degree of threat to the United States with drug running and the like. So what would you do about it? And that's the challenge that he is now posing to others, saying, if you have a better idea of how to deal with bad people, and history would suggest you've not been very good at this, come up with it. But if not, I'm going to defend my country. And I think the Prime Minister, as so often he has to be with Trump, will have to hold both these ideas in his mind and be very cautious with his statements about what he really thinks about all this.
Mariano Alba, we heard the president describing Maduro as an illegitimate dictator. He talked about how he'd personally oversaw a drugs cartel and flooded the United States with lethal poison. And he's now going to be indicted on a court in New York, we understand. What's your understanding of the legal position?
Well, I think that from a legal perspective, it's really difficult to find any sort of ground from an international law perspective for what we saw today, right? This runs contrary to the world order that was established in the year 1945, which establishes a provision against the use of force, even also the threat, unless it is in the exercise of legitimate defense or with authorization of the UN Security Council. Obviously, that was not present here. But as it has already been said before here, that is not of any relevance for the Trump administration, and I think that's part of the situation and the undergoing change that countries like the UK and others are trying to grapple with, which is the U.S. government, the current U.S. government, has decided that it will try to impose its will. At least in its spheres of influence, and then there's nothing much to do so, right? At the same time, as you rightly pointed out, it is true that Maduro was an illegitimate president, that he lost resoundingly the presidential elections last year, and it is also true that since March 2020 he had been accused of narco trafficking by the U.S. Department of Justice. So I think those two things are contradictory, right? So for on the one hand, you have he's obviously in illegal business. He's obviously illegitimate, but I think that for the region, for Latin America, but also for the world, this sets a very bad precedent.
I know that you're here in the UK now, but clearly you're from Venezuela. You, I'm sure, will have friends, perhaps relatives who are there in the country. How do you think the people of Venezuela are going to be seeing what has happened here?
I think there's a lot of expectation because in Venezuela we have had in the last 25, 30 years many instances where we thought that real change was going to come, and in the end it didn't happen. And I think that the people undertook huge risks. The majority of the Venezuelan population undertook huge risks last year, voting under a repressive system. And what we just saw today is that the U.S. government has discarded that, has discarded the person that was elected as president, has discarded the leader of the opposition, and is saying that it is the U.S. that is going to rule the country. So, in a sense, what happened in that press conference today, what President Trump said, he's basically validating what has been the historic discourse of Chavismo since it arrived to power, which was that the U.S. is an imperial actor, that it wants to have a puppet government in the ground, and that is only interested in controlling the Venezuelan resources. So,
well, I do want to go back to Brett Bruen on that point because, as you mentioned, as we heard from President Trump, he talked about Venezuela's wealth of oil, its oil facilities. He claimed that Venezuela had seized American oil, but he also then seemed to be suggesting that the United States was going to take control of all of this. I mean, how much concern do you think there will be there in the United States at the way that President Trump has conducted all of this and is explaining his motives?
Well, this is the problem, Carol, that he is trying to justify what the U.S. did through a laundry list of things that don't necessarily all add up. They don't necessarily all hold up in a court of law. We have, on the one hand, international law. And, as a student of international law, I can certainly align myself with those who are outraged that so many of those precedents, so many of those principles were violated early this morning. On the other hand, you have American law, and that, quite frankly, is a whole different kettle of fish. And Trump is going to face a whole lot of scrutiny, not least from Congress. He undertook this action without even informing Congress. And you heard the comments both by Trump and Secretary Rubio, who said, well, we were worried about a leak. There are procedures in place to inform leadership in Congress to ensure that the U.S. U.S. administration is following the law. And American presidents are not allowed to engage in foreign military intervention without consulting Congress, without getting approval from Congress. And this notion, Trump is saying, well, we're taking over Venezuela. He has not yet gotten that authorization from Congress. So, for listeners in the UK, I think it's really important to focus in on what happens next on this point, because Trump is going to have to go through some legal process. He cannot send U.S. military to occupy Venezuela. It will be challenged in the courts here. There will be a whole rigmarole politically. And you're already seeing Republicans contort themselves into political pretzels, trying to justify what Trump is proclaiming he will do at the press conference in Mar-a-Lago. So this is going to be complicated. That being said, Trump obviously doesn't necessarily feel constrained by whether it's legal or political gravity. So will be interesting to watch what plays out. But he has also been constrained increasingly by the courts here in the US, as well as just, quite frankly, Republicans. And important, again, for UK listeners to bear in mind, the Republicans are running for re-election in our legislative elections this November. So they're going to face questions from constituents about why are we spending so much time, let alone so much money, on this operation, despite Trump's promises that there are fields of gold in Venezuela that will repay all of this expense.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, President Trump said running Venezuela is putting America first. We want to surround ourselves with good neighbors, he said, and we want to surround ourselves with stability. But I mean, if the United States is actually going to be apparently somehow running Venezuela, and he said he wasn't afraid to put troops, put American boots on the ground, he said at one point. Do you think that there will be some concern within the Republican movement amongst the MAGA base, the Make America Great Again base, who do not want the US involved in foreign countries? They want to focus on what's happening there in the United States.
Yeah, so this comes at a very fragile moment for his political coalition. There's already a whole lot of concern that Trump has been ignoring the question of affordability, rising prices, and that is going to cost Republicans in these legislative elections. On top of that, Carol, as you mentioned, there are a lot of those in the MAGA movement who signed up to this because they thought an isolationist movement. They thought this was truly about America first, indeed, maybe America alone. And so now Trump's trying to convince them that somehow, not just an individual operation, which we saw in his first term, like against Bashar al-Assad in Syria, but the sustained presence of U.S. military, of U.S. Operations in a foreign country somehow comes back to the direct core interest of Americans. And he has tried to justify, for instance, the attacks on those vessels at the high seas, suggesting that it was taking out drugs that would have killed Americans. And we can get into whether or not it was cocaine on board or fentanyl or apparently even marijuana that was washing up on the Colombian shores. The point of it is, Carol, that he is, I think, increasingly going to face both hard questions and potentially Congress intervening in some way, shape, or form, saying, we're going to start taking some of these authorities back, because Trump has claimed broad powers that he can exert. But I think this is going to create a whole lot of unease, and he doesn't have a big majority in Congress. So he loses a couple of those senators. He loses a couple of those members of the House, and his whole agenda is going to grind to a halt.
Alistair, one of our listeners, Robert, has got in touch to say Prime Minister Keir Starmer has once again demonstrated his complete lack of backbone with a typically supine and impotent statement. There will be some on the Labour benches who will be very unhappy indeed about what President Trump is doing and what he said about it, that will be wanting Keir Starmer to take a more robust stance. But I wonder whether perhaps the Conservatives, your party, might actually be more supportive of what President Trump has done here.
Well, I don't speak for either the Conservative Party or the government, Carol, so I can't give you a take on what Priti Patel or colleagues may think about it. But I mentioned at the beginning of the programme my sense that in one aspect, Donald Trump is on strong ground here. No one is going to make a case individually for President Maduro after his handling of Venezuela and everything that he has done and is responsible for. So he's a good target. The issue is not that. The issue is whether by preemptive action, a state can do what the United States has done. No consultation with anyone else, no legal redress, simply taking action on its own. And what that means if the United States or President Trump decides that others, individuals or states, are harming him. We've seen recently that the US has taken action against former European officials because it believed that they were responsible for restrictions on freedom of speech. So they've sanctioned them. What we're seeing is the United States making its decisions on its own behalf. Now, there will be some that the United Kingdom and the Prime Minister would agree with. There will be others that will be contrary to UK interests. Now, I imagine he will have to judge each one. But as Prime Minister, he cannot walk away from an international rule of law by which the United Kingdom and all of us in Europe seek to abide, simply because Donald Trump has picked on this occasion a good target. Because what are the consequences? What happens when someone arises in Venezuela who does not like the rule of the United States? I mean, there used to be a word for countries that took over other countries and used their own resources to pay for running another country. It's gone rather out of habit now. But is that what the United States is really contemplating? Is it his decision what will be a judicial transfer of power? Where does the Venezuelan people come into all this? Now, that's the danger of what he's done. And that's why the United Kingdom, I suspect, will not be overwhelmingly welcoming this. It will, I suspect, produce a view from both major parties saying this was a bad man who had to go, but the way of doing it poses other questions for the international community and for the rule of law by which the United States also seeks to abide.
We are seeing these extraordinary pictures of President Trump watching this operation as it was carried out. There are still photographs that have been released by the White House showing the President Trump watching the operation, along with Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, and Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War. Mariano Alba, we now know that the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, is going to be facing a court, probably in New York, on narco-terrorism charges. Do you think that is legitimate?
Legitimate in what sense?
Legitimate in any sense. I mean, the president is saying, look, he flooded our country with these poisonous drugs and so on. President Trump said that Maduro had been running a drugs cartel. I mean, if they're going to bring charges on that in a US court, is that a legally legitimate way to proceed?
Well, I think that it could be, right. I think that's for U.S. courts to decide. Whether the U.S. has jurisdiction. The Department of Justice is accusing Maduro of basically flooding the U.S. with cocaine. That would have to be proven, among other charges. Obviously, perhaps what could be questionable, as we were discussing, is the method of capturing Maduro, which we know is against international law. But I don't think I'm not against the U.S. Pursuing and submitting to trial people involved in narco trafficking, right? So, but I also think that it's going to be a question for a U.S. jury to decide whether the U.S. Department of Justice has enough proof to basically confirm what the U.S. Department of Justice is alleging in its indictment, and that's going to be a long process. Obviously, we also know that according in the U.S. system, there's the possibility of potential collaboration between the Department of Justice and Mr. Maduro for exchange of information. So this is going to be a long process, but to be honest, I expect that in the end, Maduro will be found guilty, and he will very likely face prison for many years in the U.S.
Brett Bruen, one of our listeners, Alan, has got in touch. He says, interesting that every commentator and listener seems to concentrate on Trump and what a terrible thing he's done and what an awful president he is. What about the people of Venezuela that have been freed from their dreadful president who was illegitimately in power and has ruined the country? I mean, is it possible, Brett, that Trump could be actually hailed by the Venezuelan people with delight that he's freed them from this dictator?
Yeah, there are going to be a number of Venezuelans who will welcome this. They will open the champagne bottles and toast Trump tonight. But look, it also is a matter of what comes next for them. And if there will be, quite frankly, and Carol, we haven't yet raised the prospect that you have a number of armed groups that Maduro and the Chavistas had equipped in the event that the U.S. were to intervene. And this is, part and parcel of Chavismo, was this notion of this sort of revolutionary fighting, and if need be, that they would undertake this effort at fighting from the mountains and from the Amazon forest in the southeast of Venezuela. I think that is obviously a concern, one that I would have were I still at the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela looking at the situation. But it is true. Here in the United States, we have mass Venezuelan diaspora. I was just in Miami this week with a number of Venezuelans, and you can rest assured that many of them today welcome news that Nicolas Maduro and his wife, who were so central to the repression of the Venezuelan people, important to note as well, tens of millions of Venezuelans have had to flee, including many on foot, across the Andean mountains in order to just get on with their lives, to free themselves both from political repression, but the level of health of many Venezuelans who were starved, who were denied medical treatment and medicines under Maduro. All of this important to bear in mind at this hour, that Maduro and Chavez before him were incredibly repressive leaders. So yes, there is an important step towards their liberation, towards them being able to once again breathe free on Venezuelan soil. But there is going to also be a lot of them holding their breath for what comes next.
Brett Bruen, former Director of Global Engagement at the White House, now Director of the Global Situation Room. Mariano Alba, Venezuelan lawyer. Alistair Burt, former Conservative Foreign Office Minister. It's been great to speak to you all. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon.